Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Cath and this is made by Cath Craft. Thank you very much for joining me for this video, which is going to be all about my sewing preferences, and it is called Sewing This or That. So across YouTube, I've seen some other sewing vloggers do Sewing This or That. Most recently, Angela from Devon Thread Tales, who I really love. And I've really enjoyed hearing all about their sewing preferences as they go through a series of questions, and you have to choose one option from each question that sort of suits you best as a sewist. So I'm really looking forward to trying it out myself. I've got the list of questions that I borrowed from the other vloggers. I think people have been tagging each other on YouTube to have a go, and no one's actually tagged me, at least not yet, but I thought I really fancy giving it a go anyway. So hopefully you'll enjoy hearing all about my sewing preferences through this series of questions that's been created by somebody out there. Thank you to whoever created them originally. So that's the plan for this video. I've got the questions here all ready to go. I haven't looked at them in too much detail yet because I wanted my answers to be spontaneous, and I'm really looking forward to going through them all and having a think about my answers. But as usual, I'll start the video off just briefly by talking about what I'm wearing today. And it is a very rainy, gloomy day here today in the south of England. So I thought I'd put on a nice bright handmade top. I haven't had this one out for quite a while, but it always cheers me up when I put it on. I think it's definitely one of the brightest things I own. So it's a jersey top that I made using one of my favourite patterns, which is the Freya top pattern from this book here, the book Stretch by Tilly and the Buttons. It's just a nice close-fitting jersey top with this sort of mock turtleneck neckline. I've gone for the long sleeves. And I made it in this really fun cotton jersey fabric that's got like a rainbow leopard print going on it. Yeah, it's something I made when I was quite new to sewing, and I was really enjoying choosing all the prints, and I still love it now. And then I'm wearing it underneath a pinafore that's actually a ready-to-wear pinafore I got a few years ago. I did get it after I'd started sewing, but it's one of those things, I saw it in the shops and tried it on, it just fitted really well and I really loved it, so I thought I'm going to get it even though I'm trying to sew myself a handmade wardrobe. And actually I've tried to recreate it recently, or more recently, in a denim fabric, like a blue denim, using this pattern here, which I think is quite similar to the pinafore. And it is the Fiona sundress pattern by Closet Core Patterns. It's got the same sort of princess seam lines that this pinafore has, and the sort of button down front and a very similar neckline too. So I've got sort of two versions of this, but this is my ready to wear one I'm wearing today. It's actually really comfy. It's in like a stretchy denim fabric, so although it's close fitting, it's very stretchy and comfy too. But I'll put a picture up so you can see what my outfit looks like on. I've got it paired with my trusty Fairline Dr. Martin boots I've had for a few years now, and they're so soft and comfy to wear. I love wearing them through winter. So yeah, that is what I'm wearing today, but let's get on with the questions now. So the questions for Sewing This or That are split up into 4 topics. And the first topic is sewing prep. And the first question in this topic is buying new or stash busting. And I've been sewing, I think, for about 4 or 5 years now. And when I started, I was very excited about buying new fabrics and choosing lots of fun prints like this one I'm wearing today. And I was sewing quite a lot of clothes at first. I was very enthusiastic to make myself a handmade wardrobe. I wanted to sew all the patterns and all of the fabrics. So I was all about buying new fabrics. But I did end up amassing quite a few pieces of fabric. Not generally uncut fabrics, because I generally buy fabrics with a particular plan in mind, and I like to actually see that plan through on the whole. But I did end up with quite a few sizable remnants that became a little bit overwhelming for me because I don't like to have a large stash. So more recently, if you've been watching my channel, more recently you'll know I've been doing quite a bit of stash busting to try and use those remnants up. So I've been making things that need smaller amounts of fabric, like sort of basic t-shirts and knickers and that sort of thing. And I've actually been really enjoying sort of thinking about how I can use those remnants and using older pieces of fabric that I love and I've still got some left of. So I think at the moment I'd say I'm very much about the stash busting, but once I've sort of cleared down my little stash of remnants, which isn't too big now at all, I think I would like to go back to buying a few new pieces of fabric and treating myself probably a bit more thoughtfully than when I first started sewing and I was just really enthusiastic to buy lots of things. But at the moment, I think I'm all about the stash busting, but that may change, I think. So the next question in this topic is PDF or paper patterns. And this is quite an easy one for me. I'm definitely a paper pattern girl. I do have some PDF patterns and I can see the advantages of them, like be able to store them on your computer so you don't have to store the hard copy and that sort of thing. But I just love paper patterns. There's something about them. I really like seeing the designs that the pattern companies have gone for on the front cover. I think it's really interesting seeing sort of what sort of vibe they've gone for. I like all the information you get on the back. I really like the little pattern instruction booklets that you get inside, and I just love everything about a paper pattern. So although I do have some PDF patterns, I think if I had the choice I would probably generally choose paper, unless I'm in a big rush and I wanted to get the pattern straight away and get right on with it and didn't want to wait for the paper pattern to arrive. I guess that's when I might buy a PDF. But I know, for example, recently True Bias has released a new pattern and they released the PDF pattern ahead of the paper pattern, and I really like the look of that pattern, but I am very tempted to hold off and get the paper pattern to add to my True Bias paper pattern collection, because I do love having them all together and enjoying having a look at them and looking through them. So yeah, I'm definitely a paper pattern girl. So the next question in this topic is cutting out or tracing patterns. And I know with PDF patterns, a lot of people love them because you don't have to do any tracing. You can get them printed out over and over again and cut out each time, every time you want a different size or a different view or anything like that. Actually, I'm a big fan of tracings. I would generally always trace over cutting out. Even where I've had a PDF pattern printed out, I generally then trace off it rather than cutting into it, unless unusual circumstances like I'm really, really pressured on time. So yeah, I'm a big tracer. I find it quite mindful actually. And I always tweak my pattern pieces quite a bit. So I quite like the fact that I've always got the original there and I can play around with my traced out pattern piece as much as I want. Even if it is PDF and I could print it out again, I still quite like having it there as a backup, just in case I need to go back to it and retrace or anything like that. So I'm definitely team trace. And I know I've been asked before what tracing paper I like to use. And I like to use Burda tissue paper, which I just get from Amazon. I'll link it down below. I've got an Amazon favourites list with all of my favourite sewing things on there, and it's on there, so I'll link it down below. But I find it's really nice tracing paper. It's substantial enough so that if you keep pinning it over and over again, it seems to hold up quite well and doesn't tear too readily. But equally, it's quite nice and lightweight and see-through and easy to sort of store. It's not too bulky or anything. So yeah, I'm a big fan of tracing, whether it's a PDF pattern or a paper pattern. Some people might think that's a bit weird that I trace off PDF patterns too, but I quite enjoy it. I quite like that part of the process. And yeah, definitely tracing over cutting out. So the final question for the sewing prep topic is toile or just go for it? And this is a tricky one because I do a bit of both, but I think I generally would err on the side of just going for it. And when I say just go for it, there are some standard adjustments I'd often make. Like I often know I need to do a small forward or shoulder adjustment for quite a few pattern companies. And I often need to lengthen sleeves, or I always pretty much need to lengthen sleeves by making a sort of full length sleeve garment. And lengthen the bodice as well is a common adjustment I do. So I do make adjustments rather than just going from it straight out of the pattern envelope. But I do every now and then do a toile, particularly maybe if I've read online that there seems to be some common thread in reviews of a particular pattern, like the sleeves come up a little bit tight or it's been quite tricky fitting the bodice, particularly when it's a woven fabric, I guess, and it needs to fit a bit better than a stretch fabric, which is a bit more forgiving. I would do a toile. Actually, when I made my version of this pinafore using the Fiona sundress pattern, I did a full toile of that because I wanted to make sure it did fit really nicely because it's quite a fitted garment. But on the whole, I do quite like just going for it and sort of just seeing how I get on and trying it out, and I feel that's part of the fun of sewing. So I'd say generally just go for it unless there's a particular garment that I really want to get the fit just right on, and then I would spend time on a toile. So let's move on to section 2 now, which is fabric. And the first question is in-store or online? And this is another quite easy one for me. I pretty much buy vast majority of my fabric online. There are a couple of shops sort of fairly local to me that do sell fabric, or at least in a neighbouring town there's a John Lewis that does sell some fabric. And then actually in our local town there's a haberdashery and sort of knitting shop that's recently branched out into fabric, and I have bought a couple of pieces of fabric there. But on the whole, I buy most of my fabric online. And actually, I prefer buying online, although I know you can't feel the fabrics. There's always a risk it might turn up and be slightly different from what you're expecting. And I have had that happen. I guess everyone's had that happen before. Actually, I find fabric shops a little bit overwhelming. I quite like when I'm online searching for exactly what I want and spending a bit of time thinking about it, and I wouldn't necessarily buy it the day I'd seen it. I'd maybe an hour over it for a couple of days and mull it over before I bought it. In a fabric shop, I find it a little bit more pressurising, I guess, to have to buy it when you're there, and also with all the fabric being there and it all looks so lovely when it's sitting on the shelf there, I find it really hard to choose. And I think if I went to a knitting and stitching show, I'd probably come home with very little just because I'd be so overwhelmed. I didn't want to make the wrong decision and I'd overthink it. And I wouldn't end up buying anything. I'm not very good at being impulsive, I guess that's what I'm trying to say on the fabric. So I quite like to be able to shop in the comfort of my own home where I can, sort of slowly decide on things and not rush into anything. So I think my preference is online. I've got a few favourite fabric shops that I use just generally feel more comfortable at that. But I think if I did do more in-store fabric shopping, I probably would get more comfortable with it. And I'd love the idea of being able to shop for like denims. If I was making a pair of jeans, I'd love to be able to go to a store for those, where you can really feel how stretchy they are and how lightweight they are and that sort of thing. So I can see some benefits of in-store fabric shopping, but on the whole, I do quite like to shop online, particularly when I have an idea of what I'm going to get, and then I can just take my time choosing it, rather than feeling a bit overwhelmed in real life in store. So online is my preference and what I do, the vast majority of the time. And the next question on fabric is knit or woven. And that is a really tricky one because I love sewing with both and I love wearing both too. So it's very hard to choose a favourite. I think if I had to choose only to wear one or the other, I'd probably choose knit, just because I find knit fabrics are so versatile, and you can make knickers, you can make loungewear, you can make a dress that's quite smart. I can make things for my children using knit garments. They much prefer wearing garments made out of knit fabrics. I guess probably knit fabric is more useful in my life on the whole. But there's something about woven fabrics, particularly I love sewing a woven dress with buttons and gathers and like a collar and all those details. I really enjoy sewing that. So I get a lot of pleasure out of sewing a woven dress, probably more than I do from sewing a knit garment. So in terms of practicality, it would probably be knit, but in terms of my heart when it comes to sewing, it might well be woven. So I'm not sure where that puts me exactly. If it's a question of wearing one or the other, it'll be knit. If it's a question of just sewing what you love, it will probably be woven. So I'm a bit on the fence on that one, I guess. So next question on fabric is tumble dry or hang to dry. And generally I'd always opt for hanging to dry, particularly actually the garments themselves once they are made. I would never tumble dry any of my handmade garments other than maybe knickers. Generally I wouldn't put them in a tumble dryer, so I do like to look after them and protect them, and I will always hang to dry, always outside if I can, or on an area inside. But when it comes to pre-washing, I do often wash jersey fabrics, and then if I can't dry them on the line, I would put them in a tumble dryer. And actually sometimes I prefer putting them in tumble dryer in a way, because sometimes I find if I haven't got anywhere I can lie them totally flat, and if I hang them on the line, sometimes they can stretch out a little bit. So I quite like, particularly with jersey fabrics, putting them in the tumble dryer. Then I know they've done all the shrinking they're going to do, so that I don't need to worry about any changes going forward. And I know they'll then sort of be nice and not kind of sort of stretched at all from hanging on the line. So for pre-washing, I will tumble dry some fabrics, jersey fabrics. I wouldn't generally tumble dry any woven fabrics. But when it comes to actually looking after my clothes, I would never put my handmade clothes in the tumble dryer. It is all hanging to dry and air drying. I would love to have somewhere big and flat, because I know the ideal solution is to dry everything flat and then there's no risk of stretching out on the washing line or anything like that. But I don't have anywhere like that, so I do my best with the washing line and a clothes airer. Sometimes the airing cupboard inside, if it's a horrible day and I've got a big piece of fabric, I'll put it in there to dry. Generally hang to dry all the way, except every now and then with a pre-wash I would do the tumble drying. So the final question for the topic of fabric is rotary cutter or scissors. And I always much prefer to use my scissors for dressmaking in most scenarios. I pin the pattern pieces generally to the fabric and cut around with the scissors, and I quite like the accuracy of the scissors and I just enjoy using them. I will every now and then get my rotary cutter out if I've got a really slippery, shifty fabric. I might get it out for that, so I don't have to pin the fabric and risk snagging it, and also I don't have to risk it shifting a bit when I'm sort of lifting up slightly to cut it. I just put some weights on and kind of go around the edge with the rotary cutter. Or I also might use the rotary cutter if I've got some very long straight pieces to cut and I can just kind of roll along with the rotary cutter it can be easier than with scissors, but for most of the time I would opt to use scissors. I just enjoy using them more than the rotary cutter. I just prefer the control I have with them. It saves me getting out the rotary cutter mat as well, so that's one less thing to do, but that's not a big deal really. But yeah, I just definitely am a scissors girl rather than using my rotary cutter. So that brings us on to the next topic, which is clothing construction. And the first question in this topic is follow the pattern or wing it. And generally I do like to follow the pattern. I quite like to sort of follow rules, do things properly, and I do worry sometimes that if I do kind of go too much off-piste, it won't end up turning out right, or there'll be some reason later on why things needed to be done in a certain order. I do often try and read the pattern through before I get started, but sometimes I think it's hard to really appreciate the whole process when you haven't started. You've got to just get stuck into it. So yeah, generally I like to follow the pattern, but I will deviate from it if there's a particular way I like to do things that differs slightly from the pattern. Particularly now I've got a bit more sewing experience, I won't sort of stick to it as rigidly as I would have done when I first started. And with some patterns I've made loads of times before, I'll just do it in whatever order makes sense to me because I don't need to look at the instructions. So I'll just do it in my order of preference and know where I need to get to at the end. So I would say on the whole follow the pattern, but not always to the minor detail, and I will mix things up yeah, every now and then, just as I feel like it makes sense or if I want to change it up. So but yeah, mostly I would say follow the pattern. I definitely wouldn't be up for totally winging it. That wouldn't feel so comfortable for me. So the next question on clothing construction is bias tape finish or facings. And I have a very strong preference towards a bias tape finish. I'm not a big fan of facings. When I started sewing, I'd always put in a facing or bias tape, whichever the pattern said she should do. But now I'll generally switch out a facing and put in bias tape wherever I can, because yeah, I just don't like facings. I don't like how they kind of flap out a bit. I know you can sort of secure them, but I still find they flap a bit. I don't like how when you try and iron the garment, it's quite hard to iron them. If you iron them out, they just don't kind of sit right nicely in. But if you iron them in, there's a risk that they sort of show through a little bit on the fabric on the outside. And I feel like particularly when you sort of, you sew the facing, then you often snip the seam a little bit so it sits nicely. And I find with a bit of wear and tear, sometimes that can end up with quite fragile seams as well. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of facings. I really love bias tape though. I like making my own bias tape. I quite enjoy that, sort of using little fabric scraps to make it and then choosing bias tape that will go nicely with the garment. And I really like sewing it in. I think it gives a really lovely finish. So yeah, I really love bias tape. Much more prefer it over facings. So the next question on clothing construction is French seams or serged seams. And I think for the majority of garments when I'm making them, I would serge the seams, so I'd use my overlocker. I find it gives a really nice sort of robust finish. I like my overlocker. I don't mind rethreading it either, so I'll take the time rethreading it to make sure the thread is fairly nicely matching. Although I don't have a huge range of overlocker threads, I do spend a bit of time figuring out which one will be the best match. So yeah, I generally will overlock the edges of my seams, but I do occasionally do French seams, particularly when I'm working with a kind of maybe a fancier fabric, and I think it just gives a really pretty clean finish on the inside. Or I've had a couple of fabrics that have been very fray, and I just thought French seams would protect the fabric the best, so I spent a bit of time doing all the seams with French seams. I had maybe I think it was an Ikat cotton, and it was a lovely fabric, and I wanted to make sure it would last, and I wasn't sure even if with the overlocker it was last. I was a bit worried, so I thought I'd do the French seams and take the time. And I do quite enjoy doing French seams and taking the time over them every now and then, but I don't think I'd enjoy it doing it on every single garment. So I'm very glad to have my overlocker for the majority of the time, which is what I generally would use. So the next question on clothing construction is, I think, a bit of a random one, or quite a niche one maybe, but it is Buttonfly or zipfly. And I've never actually put in a Buttonfly. I've done a few zipflies in my time on skirts and on my ginger jeans and things, but I don't think I even have any patterns that have a Buttonfly. I think the Lander pants by True Bias has a Buttonfly maybe, but I don't have that pattern. So it would have to be zipfly. I do like a zipfly. I quite enjoy the process of putting them in. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of inserting zips generally, but I quite like the whole process of the zipfly. If you kind of follow the instructions, I think it's quite clever how it all comes together. So I would say zipfly. I think generally for my own jeans as well, I probably would find it easier using a zipfly than a Buttonfly as well. I don't think I have any clothes with a Buttonfly that I can even think of. So it would definitely be zipfly to me. I wouldn't be averse to having closed the Buttonfly, but I can imagine it'll be quite fiddly doing those buttonholes. And I worry about my sewing machine being able to manage them, because it can be a bit funny on buttonholes in sort of narrow, tight spaces. So yeah, it'll be a zip fly for me. So the next question is also related to buttons, and it is hand sewn or machine sewn buttons. And I hand sew 100% of my buttons. It's not that I don't want to use my sewing machine to sew on buttons, it's just that I've tried and I haven't got on with it very well. I found it really hard to get the buttons to stay put. I've tried to follow the instructions for my sewing machine, but yeah, I find it really hard to get them secure there. I worry about the needle hitting the wrong place and either breaking the needle or damaging the button. And I just never quite got my head around how to machine sew my buttons on. So although my machine should be capable of it, I don't actually use it for that. And I don't mind hand sewn buttons on too much. I do find it quite a relaxing, mindful thing to do. I quite like sort of lining up all the buttonholes, and I'll pop a little pin through and make a little mark exactly where the button is going to go. And I always try and do the same amount of threads through each button. So I usually do like 4 or 5 threads through to secure the button on nicely, to make it nice and matching through the buttons. So I have a little process going on for hand sewing the buttons. I would maybe one day to sit down with somebody that could show me how buttons can be sewn on easily with the machine, because I know a lot of people do it and find it really handy and time saving, but yeah, I just haven't cracked it quite yet. So yeah, buttons are hand sewn will be hand sewn by me for the foreseeable future, unless I can somehow figure out how to get my machine to do it without breaking a needle or a button, or buttons flying about the place or anything like that. So next question on clothing construction is fusible interfacing or sew-in interfacing. And this is a nice easy one. I've only ever used fusible interfacing. I never tried sew-in interfacing, and I'm not particularly fussed about giving it a try unless I end up sewing something where fusible interfacing isn't going to work. Then I maybe would try it. But for all the garments I've made to date, I found fusible interfacing works really well. I really like the Vlieseline interfacing. I use a lot of the F220. I find that works quite well on a number of different fabrics. That's generally my interfacing of choice. Fusible interfacing all the way. Yeah, I just think it works really well. So if it ain't broke, then why change it? So the next question on clothing construction is snip as you go or all at once. So I think this relates to all of the little thread tails you get as you sew your seams through the sewing process. And I must admit, I'm not always totally consistent on this. Actually, recently I was making a garment for my mum, and I was really conscious of snipping every single thread tail as I went through, because I thought I'm going to miss one otherwise, and I don't want to gift something to somebody else that has loose thread tails that are here and there. But when I make things for myself, I'm a little bit more relaxed about it, and I will try and snip as I go, but I don't think I always 100% do remember to. So sometimes it gets to the end, and I don't generally do a check at the end. I haven't even thought about that until this question, the idea of having a look at the end and doing lots of little snips, but it's a really good idea. Often I just get to the end and I'll put the garment on, and when I go to wear it, I'll find a thread tail and snip it off at that point. So yeah, I probably could be a bit more consistent about this and actually think about whether I want to really make an effort to snip as I go, or do like a once over at the end and have a proper look and make sure everything's snipped. So definitely food for thought, this question. It's not something I've got a proper routine on like I have with my hand sewing buttons, where I have a little routine going. Definitely could think about being better with that, to make sure that there aren't any loose ends hanging out when I go walking out in my me-maids out and about. And in a similar vein, the next question is press as you go or all at once. And I'm a bit more consistent on this. I do try and press as I go. I do feel like pressing can make a huge difference to how the end sort of handmade garment turns out. So I generally have my sewing machine out when I'm sewing, and I'll be back and forth to it as I go. And I do like to press as I go along and make sure all the seams are nice and smart. And I like to kind of, give the hem a good press when I've finished, because I think it stops it it can sort of naturally sort of wave a little bit once you've finished sewing. Give it a nice press, can just give a really nice finish. So I do try and press as I go. I don't think I'd ever press all at once. I do try and sometimes get a few bits together and press them at once, I guess, sort of in the sewing process, so it's worth turning the iron on for. So I guess I do press all at once in that sense, but generally I try and keep on top of the pressing, because I do feel like it's quite important for getting a nice finish, particularly when it comes to woven garments. I think it's really important. So yeah, press as I go and make sure I always do that step. So that brings me on to the final topic for this sewing this or that. And the final topic is sewing habits. And the first question for sewing habits is daytime seamstress or late night seamstress? And this has changed quite a lot for me over the years actually. When I first started sewing, my children were very little and they weren't at school, so they were at home with me most of the time, other than maybe little sessions at preschool and that sort of thing. But I generally had no time in the day to sew. So in the evening, as soon as they were in bed, and they used to go to bed quite early when they were little, I'd get the sewing machine out and I'd be so busy sewing every evening. My husband would have to watch the TV with the sound of the sewing machine in the background. And I really loved it. And it was that time for me that I didn't get in the daytime when I was very much mum, and at the weekends too. But now my children are both at school and they're a bit older, so things have changed quite a lot. They're up later in the evening, so I don't generally do any sewing in the evening. By the time they've gone to bed, it's not really worth getting the sewing machine out because I don't have a dedicated sewing space. I have a dining table that functions most of the time as a dining table and every now and then as my sewing space when I want to change it to that. So now they're at school, I generally do my sewing in the day, in the week. We're too busy at the weekends to do much sewing. In the evening, if I have a bit of time, I'll probably pick up a knitting project and do a few lines of that, or a crochet project. So the daytime is my sewing time, which I fit in amongst other things. And it's quite nice actually, because I'd say generally I am more of an early bird than a night owl, like I'm a lark rather than owl. So I think in a way I do prefer sewing in the day because I'm a little bit more with it maybe than late in the evening when my brain's going to sleep a little bit. But so it is nice now, and I think I'm sewing a bit less frantically than when I first started sewing, where I was so keen to get onto it and make all the things. So yeah, the whole thing has changed quite a bit now. So I'm definitely a daytime sewist now, having been a nighttime seamstress for a few years there before. And the next question in this sewing habits section, I think I started to answer there already. It is slow and steady or frantic sewing. And I think I said that when I started sewing, I did sew quite frantically. I was just so enthusiastic about being able to create clothes that fit so nicely using exactly the fabrics I wanted. It was so lovely and I was so enthusiastic. I really was sort of sewing fast just because I wanted to sew so many things. But now I've been sewing for a few years, I definitely slowed down, and I think I've learned to enjoy the process a bit more rather than rushing it, and just take my time over each step and be a bit more mindful about the whole thing, I guess. Think about now what I need in my wardrobe, because I've amassed quite a few things having sewn for a few years. So I take more time choosing the fabrics, and I take more time over the garments to get the fit right. I guess maybe some of my earlier garments, I didn't make the adjustments, like the forward shoulder adjustment, and I can kind of notice it a bit, even though I still enjoy wearing them. So I think now I'm a lot more slow and steady, and I take my time over it, and I want to get just the right finish. And I do enjoy it being a bit slower now too. So I think that's probably happens naturally, I guess, to a lot of people. You do maybe slow down, I don't know, but it's definitely happened for me, and I do enjoy taking a bit more time over it now and not rushing quite as much. And that brings me to the final question, which is tidy as you go or one big clear up. And for me, I generally have to tidy as I go because I don't have a dedicated sewing space, like I mentioned. I've got a sewing cupboard, I've got, which I try and keep all my sewing tools in, and everything gets tidied up into there every time I finish sewing. There is sometimes, or quite often actually, on the floor in our sort of dining come playrooms area, there's one of my patterns sitting on the floor there that I've cut out ready to sew. So there are things dotted around sometimes, but and that's generally because I'm halfway through a project and I'm planning to sew with them again. They don't generally sit there for weeks or anything. So although it's not always entirely tidy, and if you came into my house, you could probably see this, the house of someone who does sew. I can't keep everything out, so my sewing machine always gets tidied away, my overlocker always gets tidied away. So yeah, I do have to keep it quite tidy, which I quite like in a way, although it would be lovely to have a dedicated sewing space because I could just pop there and sew a couple of seams and things. I quite like being able to compartmentalise things a little bit, so when I'm sewing, I'm really in the sewing zone, and then when I've finished, it's properly put away and I can focus on other things, and then I can really enjoy it when I am in the sewing zone and everything's out. So yeah, I would say tidy as I go, although actually when I'm actually in the middle of a sewing project and I have everything on the table, I'm not the tidiest ever there. I do try and keep everything organised, but I do spend some time like trying to find my ruler under a pile of fabric and looking for where the pins have gone and things. So I wouldn't say I'm always super tidy in the middle of it, but I do try and tidy up when I've finished my sewing session. So those are all of the questions for the game of sewing this or that. So I hope you've enjoyed hearing my answers. I've quite enjoyed having a think about them. Some have been quite easy to answer and other ones were definitely a lot trickier, but yeah, I hope you've enjoyed hearing it. I really enjoyed watching other people sewing this and that and hearing about their sewing preferences. So I hope you've enjoyed hearing about mine too. So yeah, if you've enjoyed this video, please do give it a thumbs up. I really appreciate you watching my channel. I'll be back for another video very soon, all being well. But in the meantime, I hope you have a lovely week. And yeah, I'll hopefully see you again very soon. Bye.